Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. In the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of all of living nature, I want to welcome all of you to this session of Humanity Rising. This week, we've been looking at the crisis of democracy in the United States of America. The United States, founded nearly 250 years ago on democratic foundations and governed by democratic principles, has succumbed in recent years to a polarization that has led in our previous president, President Trump, to an attempted overthrow of the electoral process and the democratic institutions that have undergirded our governance from the very founding of the country. As strange as this may seem, the United States, a beacon of democracy to the world in many ways, is succumbing to an attempted coup. As President Trump in the last days of his administration sought to pervert the democratic process and an election that he lost, and he enunciated what has been termed as the big lie about the 2020 election. And the most extraordinary thing is that the entire Republican Party and the right wing embraced fully this big lie. And for the last several years has been actively, strategically seeking to subvert voter representation, the capacity of people to actually vote, and also more fundamentally, inserting people in the electoral machinery that governs elections in a way that if this next election in November of 2022 goes to the Republicans, it's likely that democracy as we know it in the United States will be no more. And the implications of this are stark, not only for the United States, but for democracy around the world. And I would say even more fundamentally, for the capacity of human beings to solve the critical problems that are challenging us in very urgent ways. We talk about climate in terms of code red. We have a code red in terms of democracy. And so that's why we have been convening a number of programs here at Humanity Rising on this critical issue. And today is the third day of a 5-day program that we're offering this week, but it builds on programs that we've had previously. And leading up to the November election, we will have more programs bringing to your attention, as we have this week, people like we'll profile today who are literally on the front lines of preserving democracy as we know it. So that's our program today. Thank you for joining. Before we dive in, let's just take a moment, as we always do, and just pause in all this hustle and bustle, all the contradictions of our world, and just relax into your body. Close your eyes if you can, and attune yourself to your heart. Just listen to your heartbeat for just a minute in a spirit of thanksgiving and gratitude that you're alive. We're all alive at this most extraordinary moment in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. Now it's my pleasure to introduce my good friend and colleagues, George Cappanelli. He's the founder and chief executive officer of Age Nation. He's been working on many fronts of social change for many decades. And he's the one who's really been carrying the passion about preserving our democracy and humanity rising, and has been convening the various programs that we've had. So George, I want to thank you so much for everything that you're doing. And I turn the program now over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Jim. And I want to back at you with gratitude for creating this platform in the first place, and for all that you're doing, not only on topics of democracy, but so many others, to make a significant difference. And I know soon you're going to have some exciting news about where we go from here, so I'll leave that for another time. I want to welcome everybody, as Jim said, to day 3. If you haven't had the opportunity to tune in to the previous 2 days this week, and for the previous week we did in February, if you go to Humanity Rising Solutions and check in the archives, you'll find 5 days of incredible stuff in February. And I say incredible not because Jim and I and John were involved, but because of the breadth and the scope of people who participated. The same with Monday's program, which was on the Reunited States of America with Mark Gerzon and just a terrific human being, Stephen Alachara, who's running for the U.S. Senate in Wisconsin. Talk about a bright light and an important future figure on the political scene. Yesterday, we were privileged to have Jenna Griswold, who's the Secretary of State of Colorado, and Eleanor McCain, who is a former Assistant Secretary of State in Massachusetts and is doing a lot of work consulting with other candidates around the country. So take some time to watch those. Today, we have another stunning panel, and in a moment, I'm going to invite my co-host John Steiner to come on and introduce the panel. Just a couple of things that I want to say that on top of the introduction that Jim made, and that is clearly for anybody with eyes that are both looking and can see, and ears that are hearing and are willing to listen, and a heart that's able to feel, we are in a critical time. And so I encourage you, as you watch and listen today, to keep asking yourself, what can I do as a citizen? Am I exercising the full scope and range of my rights and privileges? Am I doing what I can to contribute to the work that all of the people on this Democracy Dialogue series are doing in the trenches, as Jim said, to make a significant difference? What else can I do? How do I use, I have a phrase called the power of one. How do I use the power of one? My rights and my privileges, not just those granted in our founding documents, but those that are encoded in my DNA when I'm birthed on this planet. And as I take on this responsibility, not just for myself, but for the generations that will follow me. I look forward to a really robust program. Our topic today is Represent Us, Dismantling Root Causes of Inequity and Ending Political Corruption, Extremism, and Gridlock. Not that any of those things are relevant in this time. I mean, we don't recognize those are issues that need to be solved, but I know that Joshua and his team do, and I'm grateful that they're with us today. So John Steiner, consummate networker, mesh worker, he and his wife Margo do such outstanding work in so many sections of America, including helping to fund and get a variety of films of real consequence made. So John, welcome. Please.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Jim. So Joshua, Jenny, Bo, and Megan, please come on with us. Wonderful. Well, it is an honor, a privilege, a delight to introduce you guys today. I've known about Represent Us for a long time, and as we're going to find out today, there really is no one like you in this country working at the city and state level, at least that we're aware of. And over a decade, when Joshua Graham Lynn co-founded this with his good friend and buddy who is continuing this work elsewhere, Josh Silver, and is now the, president, co-director, leader, collaborator of Represent Us. So welcome, Joshua, and we look forward to a robust conversation. I'm not going to do a lot of intro for you guys because we're going to learn more about you as we go along. Megan Caska, hello. I get to read this as your Director of Political Programming with Represent Us. And I want to say one of the reasons Represent Us is really so good, and I've watched this happen over years, is the utter quality of the people that you all have been able to assemble, keep together. Many of you have been working together since you started. What you're able to do because of that really is remarkable and not so much known. But the team, as well as the leader and the leadership team, is what makes this group sing. Jenny Zimmer, welcome as well. What a background in organizing, and thanks for bringing your national organizing skills to the table. And Bo Harmon, who I understand is with us in Arizona today, but an Alabaman. As a campaign advisor, it's again remarkable the amount, Megan and Bo, the amount of experience you have in political organizing electorally that you're bringing to the table. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, George, to ask the first question, and we'll jump in.
Great, John. Thank you. Joshua, this whole idea of dismantling root causes, and of inequity and ending political corruption, big task. You want to give us some overview on how you guys do that?
Happily. And thanks so much for having us all here. It really is a treat. And I know I speak for the whole team when I say how much I appreciate the work that you all are putting in to bring this community together and to give so many people who are doing such good work a platform to get their word out. I'd like to start with a brief presentation that focuses more on the crisis at hand, because the colleagues that I brought along today are the practitioners in the field who are actually providing the solutions. So we'll have a lot of time to talk about how we're solving things. But I'll tee it up by saying this. When we talk about root causes in the political system, we're looking at the policies and structures within the political system itself that are causing the dysfunction that make us as a society unable to move forward on the issues that all of us care about. So whatever the issue is that you care about, listening to this or watching this, whatever that issue is, I can near guarantee you that it is being blocked either by the dysfunction in our political system, the gridlock, the lack of compromise, or it's being blocked by special interests who are working in their own private interest and not in the public interest. And those are the kinds of root causes that prevent us from having a better society with better policies. I'm going to key up this presentation for just a few moments. And what I'll say about this is more about the urgent crisis that we're facing right now and how it is related to the root causes that I was talking about just a moment ago. So do we see 6 minutes on our screen? Can somebody give me a verbal?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, so as you may have guessed, this is a 6-minute presentation, and it is about 6 minutes because it is about taking 6 steps. And these 6 steps are steps that could, quite literally, as has already been said on the call, lead to the fall of democracy. And I know that that can sound hyperbolic, but I want to show you why it's not within these 6 minutes. And the 6 minutes start on January 6th, where we witnessed a deadly insurrection at the US Capitol building, one I'm sure we all remember but would like to forget. But one thing that I think often gets overlooked when we remember this horrific day is that it wasn't just an attack on the Capitol building or on our government. It was actually a coordinated attack on our democracy itself. The insurrectionists were actually trying to stop the electoral counts for president from being counted. The insurrection was timed for that day because inside this brown box that you see these two women carrying were the electoral college votes, the official votes for certifying who was president. Now, trying to stop democracy in the United States through a deadly insurrection is not a partisan act. It is not reflective of the values of either America's political party. It is not conservatism. It is certainly not Republicans or Democrats. It is a newly bred extremism in this country that we must address because it is bringing us to the point of crisis. And so to think about that crisis, I want you to try to remember these 6 steps, but we're going to think about them like the movie The Sixth Sense. Now, I'm assuming most of you have seen this or remembered it. If you haven't, it doesn't matter. The plot still holds. In every movie where there's a big twist at the end, and in The Sixth Sense, there is a really big twist at the end. In every movie, you're given all of the information you need to see the crisis unfolding and understand how it's going to end. But for some reason, you don't put all the pieces together. And what we're experiencing right now in America is very similar to that. So in The Sixth Sense, it was about this kid who saw dead people. And spoiler alert, you find out at the end that Bruce Willis was actually dead the whole time. Hence the phrase, I see dead people. In this case, we see dead democracy. So here are the 6 steps that you've probably already heard about, but I'm going to show you how they fit together in a way that'll show you unequivocally what could happen in the United States if we don't take action. So step 1, I know you've heard about it, is the gerrymandering that is rampant across the country. And one of the issues with gerrymandering, as you can see in this chart from top to bottom, is it creates extremism in our political system. The gray and the light pink and the light blue areas are competitive primaries. Right? And you can see the amount of competitive primaries gets smaller and smaller over time. What this means is that nearly 87% of races for the US House are now uncompetitive, meaning we already know which party is going to win before the election even starts. As a reminder, as many of us learned in 2020, the House of Representatives could end up selecting the president in a disputed election where no candidate gets to 270 electoral votes. That brings us to step 2, changing the rules. This gerrymandering from step 1 is actually allowing state legislatures in purple states to put laws in place that not only promote the big lie, but actually move the power to oversee elections away from nonpartisan bodies and towards extreme partisan entities. And as you can see in the subhead here, in the context of 2020, that is a worrying trend. Step 3, the suppression of the vote. I know we've all heard about the voter suppression laws that have made their way in nearly 20 states across the country, making it harder to vote. And I want to be really clear. This might not be about overturning any one individual election. What this might be more about is keeping it so close that it's, quote, too close to call. So in Arizona, in the last election, only 11,000 votes separated the winner and loser. In Georgia, 13,000. Nevada, 30,000. If you cut that number in half or even more, just through making sure that only a few people can't vote, you very quickly get to a place where you might be able to say it's too close to call. And that's especially true if you have election officials in those states already on your side, which brings us to step 4, the intimidation and replacement of election officials. Now, I want to provide a caveat because I'm going to show a video. And to be clear, this video is full of expletives. It is quite intense. And it is something that is currently happening right now in the United States. So rather than turning away from it, I think we need to look towards it. But please excuse the foul language.
We were terribly concerned about every threat.
You will pay for your lying remarks, you liberal lying rhino. We will take you out. Your family, your life, you watched your...
You rigged my election, you piece of and we're gonna hang you.
Subject line are the names of my children. And I'm not comfortable reading the rest of it.
We will find you.
Do you hear the anger in my voice? We're ready to pounce.
Is probably going to be executed for treason.
It's been a rough year.
He's run out of energy.
I think this headline says it best, that these threats against election officials, who I might add are public servants in this country, are a threat to our democracy. If you remember in 2020, it was a razor thin line that protected our elections from the enormous pressure from the Trump campaign. Remember Brad Raffensperger of Georgia? Well, if you can replace the good guys and put election conspiracists and election deniers in the seats of power, it gives you the power to then decide whether or not to certify a vote or claim that it was fraudulent, taking advantage of all those new laws that we talked about in step 2, moving the power to partisan bodies. I wish I could tell you this was happening by chance, but it's actually all part of what Steve Bannon is calling his precinct strategy. It is an organized and coordinated effort to take over election administration, and it is happening right now across the country, as you just saw, specifically in swing states that will ultimately decide the election. So that brings us to step 5, claiming fraud. Bo is in Arizona today, where as of the beginning of 2022, they were still fighting against election fraud myths and conspiracies, still pushing back against frivolous lawsuits, all run by election deniers. And that brings us to step 6. Ultimately, if the Bannon strategy is effective and they put enough election deniers in seats of power, they can claim that the election was fraudulent and should not be certified. If this happens and neither candidate gets 270 votes, the House would ultimately choose the president. And I don't think I need to tell you, in this incredibly polarized nation of ours, what could happen if the House of Representatives ends up ignoring the people's vote and choosing the president on our behalf, especially with gerrymandering, putting certain people in power in the House of Representatives, especially when there has been a coordinated effort and attack against our democracy, especially as experts across the political spectrum say that we are leading towards unrest, soft civil war, and a transition from America into Russia or Turkey. We are at a red alert moment and we must take action. And I believe that in order to take action, we need to just briefly recognize how we got here. And part of what led to this was the root cause that I spoke about before. It is that our political system is experiencing a failure on our watch. In fact, back in 2016, before Donald Trump was elected president, the US had been downgraded to a flawed democracy. We have a system that incentivizes polarization, extremism, corruption. We have a system in which in 2018, just 2% of Americans trusted our elections every time. Just 4% in 2017 had a great deal of confidence in Congress. These ingredients, this brew, this system failure is absolutely a breeding ground for the kind of undemocratic insurrection that we saw a year ago today, and that continues today with death threats to our election administrators. Now, the good news is we from Represent Us are here today to talk to you about what we believe can be done. And so just very briefly, Represent Us was founded to unite unlikely allies from across the political spectrum to pass pro-democracy laws all across America. Since 2012, we have had more than 150 victories working on the ground, activating millions of Americans, winning state by state, passing laws that fight against gerrymandering, fix our primaries, install tough ethics laws and transparency laws. We've done it in collaboration with partners on the ground in states across the country. And very importantly, we've won in red, blue, and purple states alike, because in this case, when we talk about system reform, putting country over party is absolutely what it takes to win. We live in a divided nation, but we have to come together to protect our democracy. I'm going to leave you with one quote and then one final idea. So the quote is from Jocelyn Benson, who I presented with a couple of weeks ago. She's the Michigan Secretary of State, who you may remember had gunmen show up at her door. She told us that the only reason the 2020 election was certified was because regular people from across the political spectrum showed up and demanded it. We need to follow her advice and follow in those footsteps. And so the final thought I will leave you today is this. From the German president in 1920, he said, "Without democracy, there is no freedom." That means no freedom to make choices about our future, no freedom to make choices about our children, our country, our bodies. The issues that matter most to us are taken away from us if we do not protect our democracy. And so I ask you to join us in this fight, and I thank you so much for having us here and can't wait to introduce you to my colleagues.
Terrific presentation, Joshua. Really, just spot on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I wish that could run on every radio and television station in America.
Joshua, I totally agree. I think I'm still, even though we know all of this, I'm still reeling and seeing it visually, graphic, and what you guys put together with our local officials is just, basically makes us speechless. I want a few questions to follow up, but I'm going to save those till we move further along. A lot of what you all are doing really is, I'd say, in the medium term, but I'd love to hear from you and then really let you introduce our panelists again. What are you doing to protect us or help protect us in 2022? Because we're so on this razor's edge. What are your activities and your game plans to try to make a difference in this coming election?
Well, I'm really excited to introduce you to National Organizing Director at Represent Us, Jenny Zimmer, who is running our election protection program this year. But I'll just leave you with one thought about this before I kick it to her, which is very often when we talk about short, medium, and long-term work, people say, hey, Josh, the house is on fire. Now is not the time to be talking about fixing the sprinkler system. And I want to push back on that notion, because actually what we're talking about is the house is on fire and we need to turn off the gas main. Right? Like, we need to actually put preventative measures in place that stop fueling the fire that is already burning while we try to put the fire out, or we will never fully put the fire out. So short term and long term at the same time. Jenny, would you like to step in and tell everybody what we're doing in the short term?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And thank y'all for having us today. It's good to spend time with this group. When we looked at a lot of the challenges that Josh just walked us through, we really wanted to take a comprehensive look at all of the angles where we could make an impact and really find our lane where we could make this the strongest impact on preserving election administration. And so we dug in, we tried to sort of, Josh really highlighted the danger at the House of Representatives level, the impact of gerrymandering. But really there are threats throughout our system. And I think it's really important. I've been seeing some of this in the chat, to remember that our democracy was not built initially as a foolproof system. There were a lot of values and assumptions that were built into the basic premise of our democracy, and it has changed over time. So there have been constitutional amendments. There have been different guidance that's been given at different levels of election administration that is formal, informal, built into state constitutions, or just recommendations from secretaries of state. And so our electoral system is really a patchwork of practices, of laws, of state constitutions. And that means that there's an enormous number of loopholes within our election administration. And we know that there is a group of people who are working to take advantage of those loopholes. And so we really tried to look at what is required to have a stable, functioning democracy. And we identified three things: fair election administration. So the people actually administering the election are committed to a democratic outcome, small d. Two is fair legislative election processes. So state legislatures are committed to supporting their state election administration to run fair election processes. And then three is public support and trust for fair election systems. So the people need to believe that their elections are working, and that the people in their legislature and in their election administration are functioning effectively. And the threats to those things are authoritarian capture of the administration, intervention from state legislatures, and then extra legal action, vigilante action, the kinds of death threats that we've been seeing in states across the country. And so what we saw is that there is an attempt to obstruct our election processes sort of at every level. And really, there are people who are taking advantage of every loophole that's available to them. But we're seeing concentrated attacks in a few places that have similar qualities. So a significant number of electoral college votes, an increasingly polarized population, and tight statewide races, so roughly equivalent partisan participation in elections across the country. And then finally, willing allies in these highly gerrymandered state houses who are ready to run for office on a Stop the Steal platform. And that helped us really hone in on two locations that could have the greatest impact on federal elections between now and 2024. Those places are Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. And I already saw in the chat that there are a few folks here from Wisconsin. And I will say, following your news cycle has been enormously disturbing and motivating. So what we're taking on in these places is a set of both projects to make impact and experiments that will help us learn over the course of the next few years how we can really protect our election system. In Wisconsin, we're really working to bring people together to build a buffer of public support for election administrators. So y'all may have seen that the Wisconsin Election Commission, which is a fairly recent institution, it was put together in 2016 by a Republican governor. And so there have been sort of attacks from every angle to dismantle that election commission, which is functioning fairly well. We've seen recently that Wisconsin has one of the best functioning election processes in the country. And still, they are facing attacks from legislation, from gubernatorial candidates, and from sort of members of the public who are hearing misinformation in their media bubble and are concerned that the elections are not functioning effectively in Wisconsin. So we have identified 10 Senate districts that we think are critical locations where we need to ensure that consensus is not being built to dissolve the Wisconsin Election Commission. We're putting together a bipartisan community support team to support both their local clerks and election administrators through grassroots lobbying, through messages of support to sort of counterweight the threats that they're receiving, and to really educate the public on how Wisconsin's elections work and why they've functioned so effectively over the past many years. So really trying to build that sort of counterweight to extremely partisan narratives about the function of elections in Wisconsin. At the same time in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania is sort of a special case, and I'll give a little bit of context about this location. So not only is it a place that has, a very tight statewide election, as well as a large number of electoral college votes, it's also a location where elections are administered on the county level. So the Secretary of State in Pennsylvania does not play a deciding role in certifying elections. They essentially give guidance. That means that the total electoral college count from Pennsylvania is determined on a county by county level. And what we're seeing in Pennsylvania is that increasingly the administration of elections in those counties are being turned over to either partisan county commissions, or they are being replaced by authoritarian-leaning election directors who maybe don't have any experience running elections. So we're working to build community support teams from across the political spectrum. We're going to advocate to support their existing election directors who have been running functioning elections for many years, and to advocate to their county councils not to replace those folks or force them out. We'll also be testing a canvas where, and I think this might be a topic that would be interesting to this group. Folks may be familiar with the concept of deep canvassing, but essentially the idea is that people have perspectives based on their media bubble, their lived experience, their value set, and those positions are not fixed. So the ability to connect with someone on a personal level, on a values level through a deep conversation can shift people's perspectives in a way that sort of persuasion messaging or a mailer or an electoral candidate might not. And so we'll be planning deep canvases across the state of Pennsylvania to really test a script and see if we can build trust in election outcomes based on deep conversation with people at the door about their values, about their perspectives on the election, about their fears and concerns, and find common ground, which is really what Represent Us is all about. So those are our core projects. It's a series of both experiments to learn, can we really build community support for election administrators that keeps them in office despite the threats, despite the risk, because they know that they're serving their community? And can we meet people where they're at the door in their communities, find shared values and common ground, and move them on a scale of perspective to greater trust in election outcomes in their state? What we learn in these two states will help us expand our program moving forward into similar states that have these same qualities of a polarized population, tight statewide races, a large number of electoral college votes, and willing allies who are running for office at the statewide level. So I think I'll leave it there. Those are sort of a few components of our program this year.
Thank you, Jenny. Who's next? Bo, Megan, and a little more succinct so we can have a little bit more time for interactive conversation would be really, and thank you for the detail that you provided, Jenny. Bo, Megan, who's next?
Why don't I just kick us off by drawing an explicit line from what Jenny does to what we do, and then Bo can fill in a little bit of the color. So Jenny, if you go back to Josh's metaphor, Jenny's team is the team with the fire hose putting out the fire, and our team is the team addressing the gas leak. And so the Campaign Accelerator team, what that team does is work in states, cities, municipalities, jurisdictions, all over the country to address structural reform issues. So we say, like, what are the structural issues causing people to react, causing Jenny's team to be needed, and how can we pass laws in these places to make things better? How can we build coalitions? How can we do future-looking work to make reforms and make change happen that would create an environment that does not build incentive for setting democracy on fire in the future? How do we build better democracy from a structural perspective? And, we're doing that in both defensive and offensive opportunities. And I actually think where Bo is working in Arizona is a really awesome example of it. So tossing to Bo to talk more on his thoughts.
Sure. Thank you, Megan. As Josh said at the top, one of the things that we've really kind of come to recognize is that the threats to democracy and elections shifted dramatically in scope and scale after 2020. Prior to that, it had largely focused on access, making it easier to register, making sure people remained registered and weren't kicked off the rolls, and participation, making it easier to vote with expanded early vote opportunities, absentee opportunities, vote by mail opportunities, things like that. And nobody had ever thought to even question whether we need to strengthen laws around whether or not a single person, the vice president, has unilateral authority to disregard the will of the electorate or the rest of the country. Nobody had ever even thought to ask that. And now here in Arizona, we have the leading candidate for governor and secretary of state, both saying, not only would I not have certified the 2020 election, I promise you I won't certify 2024 if it doesn't go the way that I want for it to. I mean, it's open tyranny. And the violent threats and intimidation toward election workers and volunteers, many of whom are volunteers. I'm sure many of the people on this call have volunteered to do election work over the years. I saw somebody mention that in the chat. And those are the sorts of fundamental guardrails that need to be secured to make sure that our democracy is able to function. So here in Arizona, we're working to build a broad coalition, business leaders and labor leaders, academics, religious leaders, clergy. The LDS Church and the Episcopal Church are both have large denominations here in Arizona and have both been real leaders in the faith community and promoting democracy. working with groups like that, elected officials of both parties, to sit down and figure out what do those fundamental guardrails need to look like. Let's make sure that we don't have threats and intimidation against our election volunteers who are trying to carry out this work. Let's make sure that the certification process has mechanisms. If you feel that there was election fraud and you don't feel comfortable certifying the election, that's okay. But let's have a process and a mechanism to resolve that quickly and efficiently so that it doesn't throw everything into chaos for weeks and months on end. Those are the sorts of issues that I feel Arizona, having lived through the recount and the audit and everything else that they've had to go through here, are really ready to say, all right, let's make sure that the rules of the road are firm and agreed upon in advance. And then we can fight it out as aggressively as we want on the, with which candidates should get elected. But let's make sure that we all agree on the rules of the road. And so if any of you on this call have relationships or ties to groups in Arizona that could be a part of this coalition effort, I would love to be able to be in touch. But those are the sorts of things we're working on. We've had to take a step back from some of our original priorities to address this real fundamental crisis of, the basic rules of the road around democracy. So that's a large part of our effort here in Arizona that we'll hope to be able to build upon once some of those crisis points are addressed, to refocus again on questions of access and participation and equality and representation and all of those sorts of issues that are so important to us as well.
Thank you.
Oh, this is just great. And thank the three of you. I seem to have sometimes unstable internet connections, so I may freeze and hopefully you can still hear my voice. Can you guys hear and see me okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So I love the phrase that you guys use, this buffer of public support, because here you are, and it's what you all do so well, is that you really zero in on what's needing to happen that few people see or a small group are seeing, and you're working at it at this almost granular city, county level, state Senate districts in Wisconsin. So again, kudos to your ability to be nimble and do what needs to happen. And Bo, I just want to say on Friday, we're having Reverend Jim Wallace and Reverend Dr. Barbara Skinner Williams, who put together a group called Faiths United to Save Democracy. And one of the states they're working in is Arizona. So we'll make sure to make the connection there if you don't already have it. And I guess the other piece that I wanted to ask, and you really laid it out, is that, Josh, when you all started Represent Us years ago, your theory of change was let's work at the city and state level, because that's where change needs to happen. And I think what we're hearing today is you're showing the kind of validity of that game plan that you've hewed to ever since you've started. Is there anything more you want to say? Because I think the other role that you've been playing so beautifully has been supporting the groups that are doing open primaries and ranked choice voting and corruption, a lot of which you're doing in money in politics. So you guys have an overview of an awful lot that's going on at the state and local level. Sure. And you work with other organizations to do that. So I'd love to hear from you and some of the others just a little more about that.
Great. I think I'll start by providing what I will call a policy structure or framework around the idea of the root cause structural systemic reform. There are so many threats to democracy, and there are so many threats to voter access and elections and to voters, and there's misinformation. I mean, it goes on and on and on, and we are deep down the problem rabbit hole in this country. So there's a real possibility that groups like ours could just say, well, we got to work on everything at once. But what we've decided to do in terms of the policies that we're working on in cities and states is focus on three key areas. And it's preventing gerrymandering, pushing forward primary reforms like open primaries and ranked choice voting, which brings much more competition, brings moderates and independents, lets third parties run for office. And third, ethics and transparency. I see those as the sort of three key areas of reform that are important. Ethics and transparency and campaign finance, of course, to stop the pay to play that is giving us such bad outcomes. So those are the policies. And we said to ourselves, how are we going to get these passed, right? You can't go to Congress and say, hey, Congress, will you change the entire system that keeps you in power? And so instead, we look to the states. And the reason that we look to the states is that throughout American history, these kinds of big reforms have actually won in the states before federally very often. So women's suffrage and women first winning the right to vote in the United States happened in the states. Interracial marriage started in the states. Marriage equality and same-sex marriage started in the states. We see the marijuana movement doing this. We see the right to work movement doing it in the states. And it's because there is so much power in shifting culture through the states. The unique thing about our particular issue is that when you change a state law, you actually change the federal election law in that state, and you have a direct impact on federal elections. So in terms of strategy, there's like the three-part policy suite and winning in the states. What else do y'all want to add on that one?
I would just add how much what we try to do is not only work at the state and local level, but also empower, support, and like grow and build local groups doing work on these issues. So a big part of what our program does is identify groups of activists, groups of organizations, democracy tables, regional like work groups that want to make a change in their community. Maybe they want to pass an RCV law at their municipal level, or they want to do a campaign finance law in their city or at their state. And we help them figure out, how does this legally work? Like, what do you need to get together to make this happen? Whose political support do you need? How can that get done? What sort of advertising you need to do? What's your communications look like? We help folks come from the place of ideas and people energy to a place of winning a campaign and all the steps in between. And it helps develop local leaders in the democracy space, and it helps create muscle memory of nonpartisan democracy reform in the places where these things pass.
Anyone else on that question? Jenny, Bo?
I love this idea of creating muscle memory, and I think it's so important that I want to repeat it. Megan, I just think it's perfectly correct. We have lost one of the things that made America so special was that it was supposed to be of, by, and for the people, and that we're supposed to be in charge of our own laws and our own destiny, and our like manifest destiny was a big thing here, right? And we've lost it. And I think rebuilding that muscle, even if you're doing it at the local level, starts to teach people that not only they can win, but they can work across the aisle and win, which builds that muscle memory. I'm going to keep using that phrase, and shows people a new way forward.
I also, Joshua, when you were talking before about your critical threats, I watched that absolutely abhorrent piece of video about intimidation, and could see and have since heard the impact it has had on Secretary of States and other election officials leaving the field because they just find it egregious. And I think, first of all, I have no idea whether or not there's any prosecution that's been executed for any of those threats. But I think 5 or 10 or 20 years in jail would do some of those voices an awful lot of good, you know? But in addition to that, I remember Oliver Wendell Holmes used to say that in the free marketplace of ideas, truth always triumphs. Now, he wasn't born, obviously, in the social media period of time, but nonetheless, I still agree to that. I agree on its importance. And I wonder whether or not we couldn't find a way to do a campaign in every state where that kind of egregious ugliness takes place, and publish the credentials, publish the experience, and publish the messages that these Trump replacement voters in Trump replacement candidates have, so that we just publicly in local newspapers bring to people's attention not the ugliness of who they are, but just the facts about how unqualified and biased they are in these elections. Just a thought.
There's one thing I want to share here. I'm going to drop a link into the chat. But there are states around the country that are moving to pass bills to protect election workers. So there is some growing momentum around this idea of increasing the penalty for attacks on election workers, ensuring that election workers' names are not published publicly, and sort of building increasing levels of protection for these roles that historically have been very behind the scenes. You know, often it's a city clerk who's the same person who's signing your marriage license, or you know, keeping files on the city, who's also certifying elections. And so there's increasing momentum for those kinds of protections.
Thank you, Jenny.
I think Daniel pinged a really important thing on the chat too. Look, we also, a really important part of what we do is we work with partner groups. You know, we are much more of an umbrella organization. We work on a bunch of different issue areas, and we help bring the entire democracy table together. But there are groups that specialize and focus on different types of structural reform. There are groups that specifically focus on working on just ranked choice voting or just campaign finance. And it's really bringing together these folks to see how these issues work together to build a stronger democracy, and see how we can help each other, see how we can create networks. That's a really big part of what we do. John, I think you're muted if you're talking.
I am muted. Thank you. Megan, I'm going to jump in on this because you guys have done this so brilliantly in the past with your two. First, Unrig the System Summit, just the Unrig Summit, and now what you're planning for the American Democracy Summit next year. And I think you do play a unique role in this preserve and protect democracy ferment in terms of bringing people together who don't usually come together. Joshua, do you want to start and then let some others follow up with what you're doing in that regard and that meta umbrella role you're playing?
Absolutely. So I just dropped a link into americandemocracysummit.org if folks want to check it out. We are currently running a virtual series, the first of which launches May 6th. It's an exciting discussion about what's next for federal reform. And of course, that is directly connected to our work in the states, paving the way to federal reform. So part of the reason we do this summit is because there is a broad and diverse constellation of democracy organizations in this country. And one of the things that lacks in the space is the ability for folks to get together, break bread, share ideas, learn from each other, and frankly, celebrate our success while we prepare to take on the next threats. And so the summit in person is an incredibly inspiring, fun, kind of good time while we're working on something difficult kind of event. The next one is planned for 2023. And in the meantime, we've got an incredible lineup with some celebrities and some luminaries joining us for the virtual event on May 6th.
Are you recording that event?
Yes, it will be recorded.
That's great.
Yeah.
Maybe we can get some good footage from that for our next week on the Democracy Dialogues. It would be terrific.
Yeah, we'd love to.
Yeah. What on the side of Represent Us and the side of We the People, what kind of support are you not getting in some of the critical states that you would like to get? And what recommendations do you have for those of us who are listening that we could do? What can we do to help in the states that really need help?
I'm happy to share a couple of thoughts here. You know, we just ran some really interesting polling in Wisconsin. And something that we found was that people are very concerned about the strength and endurance of their democracy in the state. And there is enormous misalignment on what threats are real and what threats are not. So people are very concerned that there may be threats to their election officials, but don't necessarily believe that that's happening. And as we've shared this polling with our partners, there's been a decent amount of shock that that people are not seeing these threats playing out. Some of that is because our election workers are concerned about going public about the threats that they're facing. And so something I'd recommend, no matter where you are, is to participate in an upcoming day of action, which is an election workers support day, which is on May 2nd. That's something that I think you can probably find online, but call your clerk. Let them know that you appreciate the work they're doing. We just ran a clerk election or a clerk support day of action in Wisconsin. And we heard from one clerk who had facilitated 60, I think it was over 60 elections in her time as a clerk, and said never once had someone come in and thanked her for the work that she had done. When you're receiving calls constantly, asking whether you're doing your job effectively or worse, threatening you, never hearing that kind of support from your community can be really disheartening. And I think that's why we're seeing that 1 in 4 election workers are considering resigning before 2024. So really do step up and support your local election workers. Do some research, figure out who they are, pull together your neighbors and friends and thank them for their work. The second piece is there is a national shortage of poll workers. If you are able to sign up as a poll worker, you should do it. I think the pandemic has been a part of that, but a lot of it is the controversy around election administration. And so we saw recently in Green Bay that there was a shortage of poll workers in their municipal elections that led them to consider shutting down polling places. And that can be another that can have impacts on people's access to the vote if there are fewer polling places available to them. Those are a couple of ideas. If you are in one of these states, I really do encourage you to sign up with Represent Us, and we can engage you in statewide or local election protection teams that are meeting regularly and educating their communities on how elections work, lobbying their state election officials. But every state is different. So I might turn it over to Megan and Bo to share some of the more offensive tactics that people could take on that are more relevant elsewhere.
Yeah, one of the things that we look to do when building out our coalitions is finding the entities that really have the most influence in their location. And I think about the work that we were doing in Georgia to support ranked choice voting there. And one of our best alliances was with the Georgia Municipal Association. It's the entity this was a municipal option ranked choice voting bill. So it would have allowed local municipalities or counties to adopt ranked choice voting for their own elections. Without clearance from the state. And the Georgia Municipal Association, a big player within the Georgia legislature, was one of our earliest and strongest supporters. Not the sorts of groups that democracy and election organizations typically align with. We had support from both Republicans and Democrats. One of the only election bills introduced in the Georgia legislature that had Republican and Democrat sponsors and co-sponsors in each chamber of the legislature. And so looking for people who can be aligned with you, but that also carry sway within that particular state, even if it's not a traditional sort of ally, I think is one of the places that Represent Us has been able to really make some great progress.
So if I can follow up on that, it seems to me that that is a remarkably valid strategy. I mean, I think of the fact that a lot of poll workers historically have been older, retired people. And a lot of those people, especially as a result of the pandemic, are probably more easily intimidated than one, younger people would be, and two, maybe there's a coalition that could be formed with veterans organizations. They obviously have committed a lot for our country in defense of democracy. Maybe we could get them to defend democracy at the polls in a unique kind of way. And perhaps some of the fools and others who are trying to intimidate would have far less ability to intimidate vets and other people who have already made deep commitments to the well-being of democracy.
So George, Megan has beaten me to the link here, but I think you're onto something, and we think you're onto something. We have a sub brand here at Represent Us, a very powerful coalition we put together with leading veterans, 4-star generals from all 4 branches of the military, called Count Every Hero. And the strategy there is not only leveraging the power of the military in the way that you described, but also we often forget about like who's the best messenger to say what needs to be said. And as I think you just so well articulated, veterans have a very unique perspective on the defense of democracy, and therefore have a very unique voice and are very powerful messengers for shifting public opinion locally, which can be so important here.
Thank you.
George, again, great question, great answer. Let me follow up at this more general level. Joshua and team, one of the great things you guys have done, and you referred to it, is bring luminaries and celebrities to the table. A, would you share some of those? But B, a conversation we've been having, if in fact, which it is, it's code red for democracy. And Margo King, my wife and working partner, who's behind the scenes with me on this and why her name's on the screen, has been saying about the climate movement in what we've been talking about, nuclear war. We're actually 5 minutes past midnight. You know, not sure we can turn the clock back. Can we get national figures, and George has been talking about this, to be willing to speak out, not just code red for democracy, but call out our seditionist, treasonous elected representatives at all levels? Is this something we could take on as a kind of clarion call, whether it's with you or other organizations? Would people be willing to speak out like that? I just read yesterday that 400 students and professors at Moscow University in March spoke out against the invasion of Ukraine. I have no idea what's happened to them. I haven't seen any follow-up on that. But we're close to that. We have people, and I won't say who it is, who are working in the evangelical field to try to change things. Until they're up and running, they don't want what they're doing known because they know they're going to get slammed. So, Josh, let me start with you here. I suspect you've been thinking about that, but can we go public nationally with a group of celebrities, of luminaries, of ex-elected officials across the political divide who are willing to, and generals who are willing to speak out in a common voice about the dangers we're facing?
So we certainly can, is the short answer. And
should we? And should
yeah,
you?
We certainly already are to some degree. But I would go back to the question of who we're trying to convince. There is absolutely the need to preach to the choir, and there's a need to preach to the sort of next ring out beyond the choir, so that
our exhausted majority.
Yeah, those who are listening to the choir, if you will.
Yeah.
But I also think that there's another audience here that's hugely important, and I like to refer to them as the politically homeless. And it's those people who are not comfortable with the direction of either political party for various reasons. And they don't seem to fit into the structures of the current political system as it lies. And so one of the best things that we can do is use people with big megaphones to help reach the folks that are not the ones that are showing up in every single poll that Politico or The Hill runs. They're not the ones that Pew reaches out to because they didn't vote in the last cycle. They're the kind of massive moderate majority of this country who I think we can be speaking to. And when I say massive, nearly 50% of Americans are no longer registered with either political party. They've been leaving decade after decade after decade. And so there's a real opportunity to reach those folks. And I think absolutely yes. Some of these coalitions that you're describing are done by Represent Us. There's other groups that are specifically focused on Republicans who no longer want to be part of that party, or Democrats that don't want to be part of that, or the overlap between the two, or getting independents elected, like Evan McMullen's race in, is it Utah? Is super interesting. Utah or Nevada? I get my states mixed up. Utah. Thank you. Super interesting this year, and a real powerful coalition like the one you described is speaking up behind his race because it's so important to get new voices. Megan, Jenny, Bo, any other thoughts on how that works?
I don't know if I have much to add. I think I will say celebrities and thought leaders are very important voices. And as an organizer, I'm always thinking about like who resonates with people to bring them in the door. And so I think that is a really critical role that influential voices can play is making this movement accessible and interesting to people. In terms of impact on the state level, I do think some of the groups that you've named around faith leaders, veterans, business leaders, like these are folks whose voices resonate with decision makers who are choosing their strategies every day on how they get elected, how they want to govern. And so encouraging these thought leaders to be vocal through the media, through their congregations and communities is really critical and is part of the work that we do in our priority states. So I don't have much to add other than I resonate with that concept.
All right. Well, just to stay with Wisconsin for a minute. We had Stephen Alachara on Monday, who's running as an independent for U.S. Senate. I assume you're aware of his race. And is there any way that what you're doing on the ground is supportive of that? And if so, how? And if not, because you are a 501c3 and a C4, how does that work?
I can say we are not currently endorsing any candidates for office in our priority states. That's not a decision that we have made up until this point. And I'm curious if Josh wants to say any more about that.
I'll just say really briefly, although Megan and Bo certainly have way more to offer in terms of analysis of any candidate. We don't endorse candidates, period, because we focus on structural reform. And we find that when you start to endorse a candidate, you end up getting tied in with their agenda. And that's not our agenda. We have a very narrow focused agenda on structural democracy and don't want to alienate anybody by making candidate endorsements.
I have a question. You know, one of the ways that I think that the Republican Party versus the Democratic Party have always been more effective is that they develop a set of talking points, and every voice, no matter where they are, echo those fundamental talking points. And when we talk about spokespeople and people with large megaphones, and a lot of organizations not like Represent Us, but that are out there doing really critical work. I wonder if there's a way to synthesize the message so that it gets repeated more frequently by many different voices. And it has an impact on that, what did you call it? The politically homeless? Can we find a way to share scripts with each other as organizations and whatnot, so that we're all singing the same song periodically to audiences that need to hear it?
Oh, I'm wondering if I can turn it to you, since you came from a long history of the McCain type Republican.
Sure. I feel like part of all of this kind of goes back to the conversation about celebrities, and the reason that we build these broad coalitions with as many people as possible is because everybody has different voices that are going to be impactful to them. To me, having a movie star say, hey, you should do this, that's not terribly impactful. I mean, I watch movies occasionally, but I'm not a big movie buff. And so that doesn't mean a whole lot to me. But there are a lot of people I respect in my faith community and business leaders, academics and intellectuals. And if one of those people were to say, hey, here's a really interesting idea that you might ought to pay attention to, then that's going to have a lot of impact to me. And so having as many of those voices as we possibly can is a key part of the strategy of trying to reach and engage with as many different types of people as we can. And so doing that with the Republicans, we're really starting to see a split within the Republican Party. We saw that here in Arizona during the legislative session. A couple of pro-democracy Republicans literally were and oftentimes the sole single vote stopping terrible bills from going to the legislature. And so working to get those candidates reelected, others who are retiring to find similar sort of perspectives in their successors. And while we don't do direct candidate work, we work with these broad coalitions who often do. And it can set the table and create the foundation for the conversations of those elections to be about issues and policies that are more favorable to the people who we would support. And so bringing as many of those voices to the table to shift the conversation around democracy and election protection and election integrity away from the big lie and towards people to say, look, we ran an election and it went well and the results were accurate. And we've gone back and checked and double checked and they're still accurate. That having as many people from as many perspectives making that same argument is going to be critical, and it's a lot of the reason for the work that we do.
Great.
Before we bring Jim back in, because I know he'll have his own set of good perspectives, Joshua, what kind of funds do you need, and how do people send them to you?
Thanks, George.
Thanks for the question, George. Can I provide a little framework around the funding thing? Because I learned something a couple of years ago about philanthropy that was interesting as it relates to democracy. And that is that when we look at education, environment, healthcare, those issues, amongst others, see philanthropy in the range of $30 to $50 billion a year. That's the philanthropic investment in those issue areas. The philanthropic investment right now in democracy, not in candidates, but in democracy, is reaching just about 200 million. And what is so shocking about that is that that tiny investment, if we were to be able to double it, triple it, 10x it, 100x it, and get it up to the area where the investment in democracy was more similar to the way that we invest in environmental protection, that investment would have an outsized impact on all of the other issues we care about, not to mention our trillions and trillions of dollars of national budget that gets misappropriated because of the way that our democracy functions. So an investment in democracy is one of the most highly leveraged investments you can make philanthropically. Our organization currently runs at approximately an $11 to $17 million budget this year. And that big spread is because there's the organizational budget and then there's the funds that we can push towards other campaigns and put towards other efforts. So that's the kind of money we're looking for. We accept C3 and C4 donations, and we have 3 funding programs. The first is our grassroots funding program called the Commonwealth. $1 a month to $1,000, like whatever you can do, please join the Commonwealth and be part of this solution. You basically are, every dollar that you put in goes directly to the front lines of our campaigns. And the reason that's possible is because our larger donor campaigns, we have one called Changemakers and one called the Founding Family. All Founding Family money goes towards organizational expenses. And that allows us to put all of the Commonwealth directly towards our campaign expenses. So that's how I would encourage people to engage. You can go to represent.us/donate. Right now, our biggest funding gaps are around the 2 programs that you see represented here by these 3 individuals, Jenny's election protection program and Megan and Bo's programs pursuing new, better laws in states across the country are both desperately seeking funding at this moment. And we would certainly appreciate the help, as would the country.
George, first, thanks for your question and obviously the answer for Represent Us. But I think what you just brought up of the disparity between money that goes to democracy and everything else really could be a whole nother program we could put together with people in this field, including philanthropists. But what it leads to, Josh, is a kind of conversation you and I have been having for a number of years. What mainly is we talk about this exhausted majority or hopeless people, including disaffected Republicans, that are going to vote for their party. There's a new constituency out there that we have not brought together formally, and we could call it a pro-democracy constituency, a third force. And we've talked about organizing at this level for a long time, and I'm wondering a moment where that might actually become possible. It's why I was so excited, not only about the American Democracy Summit, but that you're waiting to do it until 2023, until some of this dust is settled. So I'm not sure this is the time to go into much depth with exploring something more coordinated and organized and formal that has power but is not a third party. As a friend of mine says, you don't want to do a third party until it can be a first party. But I just put it out there for a minute or two now, and perhaps a longer conversation another time after 2022.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the great hope is that this vast politically homeless audience can find that democracy is the issue that brings us together, that it becomes the area that we can invest in both our time, treasure, and talent.
Well, we'll continue that.
Jim, come on back in, would you?
Thank you, George, and thank you all. What a fascinating discussion about the viability of democracy as we move into the November and 2024 elections. I would like to bring in another factor as we bring this session to a close, which I think, given the fact that you represent us as really looking at, as you've put it, Josh, structural issues. But I think in addition to the structural issues, what is giving the Trump and Republican coalition so much energy and passion to make these structural suppressive moves is race. And I think I would love to have each of you comment. And it came to me rather starkly yesterday. And you, I'm sure, were watching the news conference with Governor DeSantis in Florida as he was signing into law the nation's first election police, which takes what you're saying in your first 6-minute video, Josh, to a whole new level. But also, he announced that due to gerrymandering, they've eliminated 2 districts in Florida that had traditionally elected Black people to the U.S. Congress and other places in Florida. So I think, as I view it as an American citizen, it feels to me, again, that the energy with which the Republicans and the Trumpists are moving into voter suppression is not that it's anti-democratic per se. It's anti-democratic because they need to suppress the vote and manipulate elections to keep people of color at a moment in American history where our demographics are changing radically and we're being confronted with the demographic reality that there are more people of color in the United States than there are white people. So given the fact that you're looking at structural changes in these underlying issues that affect voter suppression, I would love to have each of your comments on how race, white supremacy, neo-Nazism, anti-Semitism, play into the passion with which this is being executed.
I've been answering first and talking a lot. Megan, do you want to? I feel like we haven't heard from you in a while.
Yeah, I think this has actually been something that we have really encountered and are working in across the country as we start talking about structural reform. And I want to point to a couple of examples of ways that we've really tackled and seen this question. You know, in 2020 during the pandemic, our organization really took a lot of work on vote by mail. We first started building coalitions around vote by mail. We actually had several major African-American leaders from partners around the country say, hey, hold on, actually, this is a problem for us. We have a problem with the idea of expanding vote by mail if it removes physical vote sites, if it narrows windows for vote time. Like, we have to talk about the race implications of this democracy reform, the structural reform item. We have tackled with active debates on RCV and its nature and its help or harm in communities of color, in statewide campaigns around the country, in municipal campaigns around the country. You know, there is a lot of evidence that shows that RCV has helped women of color and minority candidates win office. But there's also a lot of fear and concern about changing the history of changing rules of the game just when folks are about to get elected. And it's, I think, very complicated. I don't think that anything that you said, Jim, is wrong, right? There are racially motivated attacks on democracy happening around America, and the approach to addressing them is also complicated. And frankly, it's going to require and need continued conversation with local communities, with partnership communities from those groups. And I think that if anyone on this call said it's perfectly figured out, then we'd probably all be lying. But I think that's some of the coalition work we're doing, trying to figure out paths forward that really take input from members of those communities, and also leadership who works in those issues from those communities around the country.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, Megan, is that working to reorient election and democracy rules to be in favor of voters disproportionately impacts voters of color and communities that have historically been marginalized from the political process. And so the work that we're doing to put voters first in terms of being able to have more choices amongst elected officials, to make those choices count more in non-gerrymandered districts, all of those sorts of efforts, while they improve democracy for all citizens, it falls most heavily the impacts on marginalized communities and communities that have not had a voice in the political process before. So it's a critically important part of what we're working on.
I know we're reaching the end, so I won't go long on this, but I will say sort of two components of election protection work that I think are very relevant is that when you look at participation in violent resistance to election outcomes like January 6th, one of the things that you see in common amongst participants, more than just about any other identifying factor, is living in a community that has quickly changing demographics, that is a historically white community that is diversifying. And so I think you do see that sense of white supremacist loss that is playing out in violent resistance to election outcomes. And so I think that is one of the defining features of the sort of big line movement. And the way that that's playing out on the local level is that when you poll people about their trust in elections, frequently they'll say, I trust my clerk, but I don't trust clerks in communities of color or predominantly POC communities. And so one of the reasons why Represent Us has really focused in the places we are focusing, which is generally these sort of demographically transitioning exurban communities, is that there's a need for both supporting clerks where they are, but also building solidarity amongst clerks and really, as we build relationships with election workers, encouraging them to support their colleagues who are under fire and under question in communities of color. So I won't say more about it. I think Megan covered things pretty well.
Joshua, closing comment on that or anything else?
Sure, closing comment on that. I mean, Megan, I thought your answer was beautiful, and I don't have much to add. I guess I would say to Jim, one of the things that I think we can do from where we sit and we stand is to paint very carefully, if painting with a broad brush, so that we don't accidentally push people who would be or could be allies further away from us. And I think that it goes back to the idea of leaning in. It goes back to the idea of being inclusive in our efforts. And it goes back to the fundamental values that I think do connect many of us, even if those values get expressed in very different ways. I've found through this work, especially at Represent Us, there's often an opportunity to make a connection where there wasn't one. that can lead to a change down the road. And I think those changes down the road can be small, they can be big, they can be structural, they can be systemic, they can be race or gender or all sorts of other things. And I would say let's lean into those opportunities.
Just to respond to that, I think when we think about structural democracy reform or democracy reform of any kind, it tends to be a liberal issue or is seen as a liberal issue. And I think, again, what you're doing at this level, reaching across divides and bringing in Republicans and independents to work is obvious, just so critical. And I think something that a lot of folks don't recognize about some of the overall work you guys do. So thank you for that.
In bringing this to a close, and I know Jim and John probably have some things to say. First of all, I want to really celebrate the terrific work that Represent Us is doing, and I want to remind those of you who are listening that none of the remarkable organizations we've been privileged to have on this program thus far can do it alone. They do need your money, they do need your support, and most of all, we've talked about a lot of things that are going by the boards in America that would not be going by the boards or would not be acceptable if we, the people, regained our voice and spoke out against it. Why there wasn't a statewide revolt yesterday in Florida amongst those people who do not believe that DeSantis should be creating his own peace keeping force or whatever that happens to be. We have to speak up. We have to get back involved. Not only the way that we support Represent Us and other organizations, but by raising our own voices in every single way that we can, wherever we have the opportunity. It's critical. The democracy we're going to save is our own. It's not somebody else's. And we need to remember it's not a spectator sport. Before John and Jim make any closing comments, or Joshua, I just want to remind you that tomorrow we have an interesting program. It's called Personal Perspectives on the Challenges of Our Democracy. We're going to have 6 or 8 really interesting people who, as citizens, will have a lot to say about what they think and what they feel about where democracy is and what we may do about that. Jim, John, any closing comments?
Jim, I'll let you have the last comment. So I just want to say, vis-a-vis Florida, many of you, if not all of you, know that there's a good candidate running against DeSantis for governor this fall, Charlie Crist, who may well have a chance to beat him. And if we're talking about preserving democracy, that's going to be one of the most interesting elections in the country. And again, I know either in front of or behind the scenes, particularly by helping to get ex-felons voting in Florida, which you guys were instrumental in supporting and highlighting, is going to make a difference. So I just wanted to close with that specific. Jim, thanks for bringing it up.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Jenny, Megan, Bo. This has been, I think, spectacular, what you're committing yourself to do, and that is seek to renew and fortify the underpinning ingredients that make democracy viable. Because as I think you pointed out, it's not anything anybody really thinks about. We don't think of our county clerk. We don't think about even mail-in voting. We kind of take it all for granted. And you folks are really on the front line, sort of in the bowels, in the infrastructure of what, if it doesn't work, the results don't have the integrity that enable people to have confidence that the system is representing the will of the people. So I just want to note that you're doing deep work, deep tissue work on the American polity at the front lines, and sort of, I would say, underneath the front lines. And that's so powerful, and it takes so much courage and perseverance. So I just want to acknowledge it. I noted that a couple of people have already donated on your website and signed up for your May 6th event. And that's what we at Humanity Rising can do, is promote people like you and organizations like Represent Us, because as George said, it's all of us working together it's going to be required to keep the democratic boat afloat in the US of A. So thank you, and we applaud you and hope to have you back maybe sometime during the fall for a report from what's the front line at that point as we go into the November elections. I know that's what George and John have planned. So that brings our program to a close, everyone. Tomorrow we'll have day 4 of our 5-day program on preserving democracy in the United States. You're all welcome to our after session chat group. Those of you who can make it, you'll see the link in the chat box that Stan has just put up. And we'll meet same time, same station tomorrow here on Humanity Rising. Bye for now. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.
Beautiful call. Beautiful.